Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second session of Building a Manifesto for Change. This is our series of online talks where we'll be exploring some of the most pressing climate issues facing the built environment in London and the UK. The series will run over 4 sessions, covering topics such as air quality, retrofit, and adaptation. We know these challenges are at their heart interdisciplinary and very complex. We just can't solve them alone. Fortunately, we'll be joined by others across the industry to have an open discussion about how far we've come in driving the change needed and question what is holding us back. We'll be using the insights and ideas discussed throughout this series to create a manifesto for change. This manifesto will be both a provocation to the industry, but also, critically, a roadmap to further the built environment's response to the climate emergency. I'm Connor Rusby, Senior Sustainability Consultant at Love Design Studio. I'll be chairing the session, which will focus on energy and retrofit, asking the big questions. For example, which barriers are preventing at-scale acceleration of building improvement programs, and explore how consultants, landowners, and even government can work together to deliver retrofit at the rate required to meet energy performance targets. We're delighted to welcome 3 excellent guests and leaders in both the domestic and non-domestic sector. We have Kisang Kajang, Founding Director of K Squared, John Cochrane, Director, Asset Management and Head of Sustainability at Feldberg Capital, and Tony Truepenny Phillipson, who leads our Love Retrofit initiative, which we'll hear more about in a minute. Before we hear from our speakers, it's important to set the scene for why this discussion is needed and why now. The reality is 84% of commercial buildings already fall short of the 2030 energy performance targets. Is this a sign of a stretched target or simply a failing building stock? London specifically is retrofitting homes, more on the residential side, 10 times too slowly to meet the 2030 target. Over the last few weeks, we've been asking our network to share their insight, experience, and opinions, which have helped inform discussions. Our first question is looking ahead to 2030. We first asked whether landlords who fail to improve their buildings in time should lose the right to rent them out. We had a real mixed response on this one. Half of the respondees voting for tying tax breaks to retrofit initiatives. A real novel approach, but would ultimately incentivize energy improvement initiatives. Next, we asked whether our adopted method for measuring the success of retrofit projects and our ultimate reliance on energy performance certificates is appropriate. Despite common criticisms on accuracy and data quality, EPCs are still widely used to measure success. Is the EPC system broken, or is it the best imperfect tool we have? 2/3 of the respondees believe it's still a key part of the puzzle and bridges issues around communication of success and results. Finally, we wanted to gather opinions on what the biggest barriers are to scaling retrofit and achieving our targets, from funding through to policy. We've had a real mixed response here, but skills shortages takes it by a nose. I'm sure this is a problem that many of us have seen firsthand on retrofit projects across the UK. Now over to our speakers. First up, Kisang, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Connor. Hi, everyone. I'm Kasanka Jang. I'm founding director of K Squared, and we are retrofit specialists compiled of a team of architects, project managers, retrofit designers, and retrofit coordinators, where we offer holistic assistance defining a more streamlined and value for money and socially conscious route to sustainable property improvements. We really specialize in helping clients work out the business case. So we assist them in pinpointing funding, in the design and the delivery of the retrofit works required to help them on their energy targets. We are a social enterprise, and embedded in our ethos is providing an overall high level of detail to delivery, within which we always advocate for true sustainability and social equity.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Kisang. Over to you, John.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm John Cochrane. I head up the UK asset management at Feldberg Capital and also head up sustainability across the UK and Germany. We became Feldberg Capital about 2 years ago. We were formerly Brunswick Property Partners, and the focus then and now still is UK London offices. We manage the Accoya portfolio, which is zones 2 to 6 in London, and then the Cora portfolio, which is zone 1. It's almost the sort of hole in the donut of Accoya. In the last 12 to 18 months in the UK, we've also diversified into UK industrial and logistics, a JV with Henry Boot, looking in the Midlands. And then in Germany, we have life sciences. We're working on a resi portfolio as well as some offices. So focused on commercial property, but the business plan for every portfolio is sustainability and ESG. And especially post-pandemic, we've really seen the value and the requirement to do that and the need from an occupier and an investor perspective. And I guess the key sort of USP for Felberg and how we approach sustainability is that my role as asset manager and head of sustainability is exactly that. It's both. We're really keen to avoid any silos in the industry, and every commercial decision that's made has sustainability running through the heart of it.
Amazing. Thank you very much, John. And then last but not least, my good friend Tony.
Thanks, Connor, and hello to everybody on the webinar. My name is Tony Truepenny Phillipson. I'm one of the senior sustainability consultants with Love Design Studio and lead the Love Retrofit team here. I started off my career in engineering and always had a particular interest in energy consumption and efficiency. And since joining Love Design Studio, I've been able to apply that experience and knowledge to both domestic and commercial buildings as part of the Love Retrofit team. Love Retrofit's main aim is to support the government in accelerating the upgrade of our building stock while improving resilience and reducing reliance on fossil fuels. Our services cover a range of retrofit assessments and energy study of properties, helping to guide building owners and residents on how best to reduce their energy consumption, utility bills, and carbon emissions, but do that in a way that aligns with available budgets and wider business goals. To go through some of the projects that we've worked on in the past and current projects, start with a project we're currently on, a few of us in the team, and it's a warm home social housing fund wave 3 project with Kasang and her team at K Squared, and that's for a London-based social housing association. So the idea of the Warm Home Social Housing Fund is that it's a government-funded scheme open to social housing associations, aimed at helping these organisations improve the EPC rating of their properties to an EPC C, and the overarching goal of reducing the tenants' energy bills. So we're acting as the Past 2035 retrofit assessor on the project, which involves surveying more than 100 properties of varying construction date, type, and configuration. And that's to understand their baseline energy efficiency and EPC ratings, and with our findings then feeding into the retrofit design process. So the Past 2035 is a publicly available specification. And it was developed to provide a comprehensive whole house framework for improving energy efficiency while ensuring quality, safety, and a reduction in common problems like damp and mold that can be caused by poorly executed retrofits. So the Past 2035 retrofit assessments do cover certain aspects that go above and beyond a usual EPC survey. We've also carried out several energy studies for large commercial buildings for John and his team at Feldberg Capital. And again, that's to help advise on the performance of the existing buildings and then test a range of potential energy efficiency measures to understand how these would impact the EPC rating. With the commercial buildings, our appointment typically includes review of information on the building fabric and the building services, following which we carry out a detailed site visit and then develop a building energy model. The model allows us to simulate the building's energy consumption and run several improvement options individually and cumulatively to demonstrate how these could impact the energy consumption and the overall EPC rating. So through this process, we've been able to help Feldberg Capital understand the most cost-effective route to meeting the government's expected target of all commercial buildings having to be EPC-B by 2030. And one final project of ours that I'd like to touch on is the retrofit decarbonisation study and energy modelling for the Barbican estate in London. So with this one, we performed a financial feasibility study to evaluate the potential energy and carbon emission savings achieved from retrofit interventions at the Grade 2 listed Barbican estate in central London. Primary objective of our study here was to evaluate the return on investment for a range of energy efficiency measures, such as improved building fabric and enhanced ventilation and heating controls. To help with this, we use dynamic simulation modeling to model the energy performance of 5 dwelling types across the estate, which we felt captured the property stock across the estate. And then we were able to present several options to the tenants there to show how they may want to improve their properties and the return on investment on those different options in the future. But that's all from me. I'll hand back over to Connor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. We'll now move on to a series of questions for each of our speakers where they'll discuss their own experience and thoughts on the various challenges of retrofit. Throughout the session, I just wanted to flag, we've got a QR code in the bottom right and we'd love to hear your feedback. If you scan it, it'll take you onto a platform where you can vote on your own responses. On to our first question. The UK has fallen behind on its EPC targets. What are the biggest challenges standing in the way of progress? Kasang, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think really underpinning this is the infamous time, money, quality trade-off that's widely known within the construction industry as a whole, and even more prevalent within retrofit, and further so in social housing, which is our specialism, where what you find within that exact tenure is just money is scarce. Especially for many of our clients with compliance upgrades, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, and they're trying to make a financially viable case. So for our clients specifically, I would say money is the key lever there in making this difficult. There is, that being said, there is a significant amount of funding available for social homes and for housing associations and registered providers. There's actually a lot more out there than most people realize. And one of our key roles is actually connecting those dots for our clients, connecting it in a way that allows for a blended finance model so that we highlight key grants that are available and most suited rather for our clients and their key criteria, to the caveats of those grants, because some of them are quite heavy, some of them are lighter. So it's really trying to make that connection. Also with existing budgets that may be occurring into things such as their planned maintenance, and connecting that also to, there is a lot of private equity out there as well, which allows for preferential rates when it comes back to interest rates on paying that back or payback periods. So it's not a one fits all. It's a kind of this elaborating and developing a blended finance model, leveraging on what's available within grants and government grants, but making sure that that's fit for purpose for the client and what you want to use it for, I think is one of the key aspects there. And showing that this is actually available. There is a route to entry here, but it's not as difficult as you may have initially assumed. And bringing our clients on that journey as well of actually understanding what is available in the market as a financial vehicle, understanding how you can actually create that into a blended finance model, and then being able to put that into practice and get buy-in from other members of the team and the board, for example.
Yeah, amazing. I think Love Design has sort of seen firsthand the work that K Squared does, really bringing the client along on that. And I think you can see it shift from skepticism to a lot of optimism as we go through the program. I wonder, John, do you have any thoughts or sort of perspectives from the more commercial sector, if there's any of sort of major challenges and shared problems?
Yeah, definitely. I think some similarities to what Kasang was saying there, and with the finance points. I think from our perspective, we totally see the value, the longer term value from an investor perspective of reaching those EPC A and Bs, and increasingly we're looking at EU taxonomy now being from a more European base and international investors, and the drive to push those EPCs is growing from investors, from lenders, and occupiers. But for a lot of the assets we've bought, we don't have vacant possession and we're not doing the heavy lifting projects anymore. They will be partially or fully occupied. And I guess from an investor perspective, long lease is normally a relatively big tick in the box, but not for EPCs. So you've got partially occupied buildings with leases expiring in 2035. or between 2030, 2035. And some of these tenants are inside the Act as well. So you may not even be able to get vacant possession to undertake retrofit works to improve the EPC. So I think when you're underwriting some of these new assets and you're thinking about EPC improvements, it is an incredibly complicated process to try and work out if it's even going to be possible. You've got to get the occupier buy into it. And I think that's the other part as well. We can retrofit from a landlord's perspective, looking at centralized plant, but very quickly there are incredibly intrusive works like fabric upgrades that you have to deliver, which are virtually impossible to do with an occupied building. And that's not even thinking about going in and looking at existing tenant fit out. So we're getting better engagement from occupiers now who, even if they've got long leases, they have their own corporate targets they have to meet. But it's definitely a significant challenge to actually driving this change.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And probably a good segue over to you, Tony. I think on our social housing projects, that problem of occupancy is such a big one. We go into people's homes that have all of their belongings and stuff built up against the external wall. Internal wall insulation is intrusive, messy, and a noisy bit of work at the heart of it. Probably not quite on the scale you're doing, John. But yeah, Tony, I wonder if you have any thoughts on occupancy and sort of handling that.
Yeah, definitely. It's quite crucial. And when we're looking at the retrofit assessments for the residential properties, that the past 2035 standard there is trying to ensure that things that have gone wrong in the past around poor resident engagement and not getting them on side is addressed. I think for the maybe to go back to some of the points that Sang and John were also mentioning on the funding, it's clear, isn't it, that we're going to need billions and billions of pounds to be invested year after year to try and meet these targets. And from my view, I'm not as close to it as Sang. You know, it feels like there's not enough funding to meet the target. So it is really nice when we're working with Kasang to know that her and K Squared are really helping to raise the flag to social housing associations first off to say, look, we can help you access this money in these different ways. But I think for me, that is still, I'd still put that down as a really big challenge. Is there sufficient funds available, and can that be accessed by the people who and organisations that most need it? Along with that, we've also got the shortage of skilled professionals and the need for quality design work and installation work, not just let's get something done and then not worry about how the tenants and the residents feel about that later. We want to ensure that work is done properly first time, and people then accept that and are happy to promote that amongst their friends and just the wider communities and other businesses, rather than relying subpar work, which has happened in the past. And again, there's also a massive need for additional funding for training. And we are seeing that there is more training of retrofit assessors, and that's another key part to make sure that the design, that from the assessment stage, the design follow through to the installation phase is all done to a higher standard. And you see it all too often, unfortunately, that you see quite a lot of news stories and negative press around retrofit of commercial buildings and residential. And you have to go on BBC. It feels like there's almost one a week saying highlighting a particular individual that might have had poor quality work done in their home or their commercial building, and then that clearly is going to put people off. But there are some good examples of success stories as well. So I think it's very important that as a challenge, perhaps, that something that can be faced up to is highlighting those to people to show, no, this is how things can be done positively. And here's the testimony from building owners and residents to say, I had these works done. Yeah, it was a bit of hassle when they were happening, but the result has been massively reduced energy bills and improved thermal comfort levels, for example.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just before we move on to the next question, I wanted to go back to like the skill shortages. And Kasang, I wondered what your thoughts on that are, given the procurement of contractors and stuff that K Squared get involved in. Do you sort of see that firsthand?
Yeah. I think there is a massive skill shortage generally in terms of numbers. So the amount that, especially in the social housing, and as Tony's alluded to, If we go with any central government funding, such as the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, newly called the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund, they stipulate that you have to use past 2035, which means certain people's certain credentials need to be assigned in certain roles. That's from a consultant point of view. And then if you flip it from the contractor point of view, it's past 2030. And again, that means that certain install teams need to have certain accreditations and validations that they're up to a certain par. And I would say the one thing that I've noticed is even with these past 2035, past 2030, trying to be a safeguard, ensuring for quality, there's nothing in there that says what good looks like. So it's up for, there's a lot of gray areas that I've noticed that's up for interpretation. So I've seen a good past 2035 and I've seen a very poor past 2035, but technically they could all both tick the box of past 2035. Now, that alludes to not only there being a shortage of the people qualified, but a shortage of the quality of the people qualified. So when you put them both together, there is a massive skills gap. And I think, as Tony's alluded to, there is more funding coming out to assist with that. But, you know, it takes what, 2 years for those people to really be qualified, get those credentials, and then really you're learning through lived experience. So I would say another 2 years of actually doing the work to boost that quality up. So we're about 3 to 5 years away from anyone really trying to make a dent in that skills gap, I think. But one thing I did want to touch on, which I think both Tony and John pressed on, was this kind of fabric first approach and, you know, the comfort or the resident or the tenant coming first. And I think what I've noticed and what I've seen as well in terms of one of the biggest challenges is the interpretation or the change in hierarchy of what's more important in what should go first. So, you know, as case where we think resident and comfort should go first, we think fabric first, and we think, you know, an improvement on the area and an impact that can be felt by the resident should be prioritized. However, you know, I've heard people saying, is it fabric first or fabric last? And should energy source actually go to the forefront? Because, you know, for EPCs, it's an easier win. But then is that really addressing the bigger targets and aim of sustainability and comfort of the people who are within those spaces?
Kasang, you're making my job very easy. So I'm going to move straight on to the next question, which is about that very topic. So next is, are EPCs the best measure of success for creating healthy, comfortable, and energy efficient homes? And Kasang, you already touched on that. I think they do lose the nuance about resident comfort and resident enjoyment of ultimately people's homes. Tony, I know you've got quite strong opinions on this, so maybe if you want to start us off.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. Yeah, I'd say that EPCs can be a bit of a blunt tool, and they don't always capture or fully capture a building's true energy efficiency. And that's partly down to working with the standard assessment methodologies, applying a number of assumptions that are built into the calculation process and the modeling. So there's certainly some limitations with the EPCs on that front. On the flip side, you know, we recognize that the EPCs are well established in the industry. There is a large pool of trained EPC assessors out there that homeowners and commercial landlords can access. You know, with the EPCs coming into force from 2007, 2008, there has been a long time to train up a large number of assessors there. And it probably links in again to Kasang's point, quite nicely put about it's fine having people qualified, but then do you have quality qualified people? And there's, of course, concerns about the variability in the assessment quality and the reliability of any EPC ratings. So we know that there can be variability in assessments due to quality and not being, you know, you might get two different results from assessors, although there are processes and auditing procedures in place to prevent those going through. But that does, again, you can see people losing a little bit of trust in the assessment methodology if they're being told two different things by two different assessors. And another point on that front is that there's sometimes confusion around the valid EPCs. So with them being valid for 10 years, both residential and commercial, The methodologies that underpin how those are calculated, noting that they are different there's a different calculation methodology for residential to the commercial buildings. We can see the methodologies and the standards be updated within that 10-year period. So you can then, comparing two buildings at a particular time, you also have to take into account when those EPC assessments were done. And I think a great example of this is when we had the updates to the grid supplied electricity carbon emission factors once the Part L 2021 came into force, and then you look at commercial buildings now, which are based on those carbon emissions versus the residential, which is based on the utility bills and the cost of those. That almost led to an overnight change in what your EPC rating would be for a like for like building. And you could see your building going from an EPC-D to an EPC-B overnight if you were to reassess at that point, if you were, for example, having all electric space heating systems. And so that can cause confusion when, you know, landlords or clients might come to us and say, how can this be EPC-D? It's the same as this property that I had assessed last week that was EPC-B. And we obviously go into the detail and can explain that, but it can lead to some issues there.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be really interested to see if you had any thoughts on that, John. Do you share the same frustrations when you're dealing with like commercial EPCs, or is that slightly more straightforward in your experience?
No, I could completely agree with Tony. And I think just to the final point he made, to have that variability in the EPCs, if we're trying to make a business case for spending CapEx on retrofit, and then you explain that actually just by sort of rolling the dice a bit and just redoing the EPC for £500,000, whatever it is, you could actually get to a target, or you could even demonstrate an improvement without spending anything. It makes an argument for retrofitting all the bit harder. So I think that's a big challenge. I mean, I think just on the question of are they the best measure for creating healthy, comfortable, and energy efficient buildings? I mean, I think no for healthy, comfortable buildings. I think they're a good language to use. As Tony said, they've been in the market for a very long time, and ultimately it's the language that regulators are using, lenders and investors are using. We just refinanced the Acquire portfolio, large new loan, and the main bit of ESG work we had to do on that was show our EPCs, and where we had low performing EPCs, show what we were going to do and when we were going to do it. So it's not perfect by any means, but and I definitely am frustrated quite a lot of the time with some of the results of some of them, even after we've done retrofit works, through some of the sort of the nuances of how you calculate it. But I think ultimately it is pointing in the right direction. And I think just like any sort of tech or innovations, there are versions, there are updates. It's just by the nature of how, when you create a product and it's put into use, you will see flaws of it. And I think that is just how EPCs are going to go. It will improve, it will get better, but ultimately it is still a way of measuring and seeking overall improvement in energy efficiency. Healthy, comfortable buildings, probably jury's out a bit on that.
Yeah, definitely. I guess coming back to like the EPC and the financing as well, I guess it's so critical to have like quantifiable numbers to back up a lot of the claims, and healthy and comfortable feel a bit more intangible, which make it really challenging, I imagine, to think about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it depends a lot on how you're framing the asset or the portfolio you're trying to refinance ultimately, where I think if you're going down the ESG, the impact fund, you obviously have to demonstrate a lot more. And as you say, you have to quantify it. So the healthy, comfortable, social, you have to go above and beyond the EPC. But I think for EPCs and energy efficiency are just seen as a requirement you have to do now, like technical due diligence or your legal due diligence. You just have to show that you're compliant, and you're not going to be hitting a roadblock in 2030. And I think it goes back to that sort of just that real estate language. You just have to have an EPC. It's just a tick box, and you sort of move on. And when it does become a problem, that's when people have to start mobilizing and looking at how they're going to improve it.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Just before I sort of ask you, Kisang, on your experience, just as a reminder, we have the little QR code. If anybody would like to scan their own answer and provide a bit of insight, that'd be great. Kisang, do you have any conflicting, or do you largely agree with the points John and Tony have raised?
Yeah, I think, what we see I think EPCs for a data quantum in a report, great, perfect. Does that align with healthy, comfortable, and energy efficient buildings? I don't think it goes into enough detail to hit the more qualitative areas there. And we also have other standards that try and assist in that, like we've alluded to, like PAS 2035, which talks about quality and how to mirror that. But again, that's even flawed. So I think where we try and come from to try and make that latter more the forefront, so the healthy, comfortable, and energy efficiency, is advocating for more of a no regrets approach. So whatever you're doing, trying to prioritize durability, high quality outcomes, regardless of the standards or the funding sources we were speaking about or alluding to earlier. It's if you're going for a no regrets approach to a high quality, then you should always, as the word alludes to, have no regrets. But I don't think EPCs advocate for that. I think EPCs advocate for data, quantum, something to compare. And, as John said, something that people who are not so well versed in the industry can kind of gauge what you mean and know what good looks like, supposedly on a very generic scale. But if you strip that away from just data quantum reporting and actually think about the user, the sustainability, what good looks like, I think EPCs aren't always the best.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really interesting. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question now. So our final question of the session is, if you could make one change to deliver retrofit at the scale required, whether this is policy, funding, training, or something more radical, what would it be? John, would you like to start us off with this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we sort of slightly touched on it on some of the other questions, but I think for us the big barrier for us is justifying the change. So financially being able to actually deliver it. And I think to me, a lot of ESG initiatives and requirements, it's all about top down. It's about ultimately the government mandating you've got to do it, and people can moan about it and question how viable it is and whether they can afford it or not. But ultimately, you've seen the impact that EPCs have had in the commercial property sector, where you're getting a green premium and a brown discount for offices for commercial real estate, and we've created funds out of that very principle that we take brown assets, we turn them into green assets through energy efficiency improvements. We're looking at social value and so on, but that has been driven ultimately by this 2030 MEES regs. We've got to be EPC by 2030, which I know is a bit of a question mark now, but even the narrative around it has created enough understanding and I guess concern in the market that you're seeing these values change and this sort of two-tier market. And I think if the government can push and continue to push the point on retrofit for the right assets, I've got to add, not every asset is suitable, as I'm sure everyone knows, but to have the top-down change. And I think it's I mentioned it earlier, but the three drivers, the regulators, the investors, and the lenders. If you can get all three of those groups to enforce the change in retrofit and energy efficiency and better buildings, it will trickle down. And ultimately, you then see from both sides, you will see occupiers then starting to understand that there are two types of asset. There are the compliant, best-in-class assets, and there are the ones where the landlords don't care as much. They're not doing it for whatever reason, but those occupiers will then want to be in the better buildings. And that's sort of first-hand information that we're seeing from the leasing that we do. And we're getting better rents as a result, better quality of tenant, staying for longer. So I think my view always on ESG, to summarize, I guess, is that it's got to be top down, and that policy piece is absolutely crucial to driving change.
Yeah, I really love that outlook. And I think you're right. The more it's pushed down from the top, it doesn't take long for tenants to realize quite quickly what they prefer. And you give them that choice of, okay, what would you rather? And I think that's really important in a commercial market. Tony or Kasang, did either of you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think I agree with what John's stating. One of the big things I think with a lot of our clients being more the social housing sector and registered providers is, even though we do advocate for blended finance, a lot of that finance is connected to central government grants to assist them in doing that. And that comes with a lot of caveats. So what we would love to see or advocate for to kind of give a bit more comfort in that area is a cross-party political alignment on the importance of certain programs to remain regardless of what central government comes in. And I might be wishing on a star here, but that you said if I could make one change, it would be that alignment, just so that gives a bit of safety that that funding won't be stripped away with a new government, which we have seen previously. And then I think also for there to be a more of a kind of area-based approach rather than focusing solely on tenure or building type. It's why don't we try and look at it in a borough, in a street, in that kind of scale, and bring that whole borough in a phased approach and area-based as opposed to tenure. And I think that there's missing a trick there because there's areas in which you could get value for money if you're delivering on the same street with the same contractors, etc., which they don't care what tenure you are if you as long as you're doing the same work, they're not too bothered. And I think that could actually be quite fundamental and can have a longer lasting change in true making an area feel the true benefits of what retrofit at scale could bring.
It's so interesting you say that, Kasang, and I don't think we've had this conversation before, but we're involved in a number of like community and neighborhood energy schemes. So installation of a large solar array, for example, on a big school that might feed local grids, and then more deprived families can have access to that energy. And that community-based approach for energy schemes like that has just like blown up. And I'm sure you've seen these community energy schemes are all over London now. And they started as a pretty niche offering, I would say. But I think the GLA and central government are beginning to understand that if you are to get private tenants to do anything, you have to do it on this like community-based approach. You've got to talk to each other and say, I've got this new air source heat pump and my bills have gone down 20%, and the installer is this guy. Yeah, I totally agree. It's really interesting, and I think certain boroughs are very good at pushing this, and then other boroughs are being a bit left behind on those community schemes. Tony, did you have any thoughts on that?
On that point specifically, I think I completely agree with what's been said there, and slightly linked to that is having almost blueprints for again it's examples and case studies and building up that library of those to say, okay, yeah, we have to go through the process. We have to go through, for Resi past 2035, and we have to go through certain, meet standards and building regs. But having examples of this building is very similar to yours. Here's a success story. Here's where it's been done well. I think that can be then very convincing. And also you can talk about this, how much it cost. These were the difficulties. And then there's a learning process across the industry, and for that should benefit installers, designers, and residents and landlords across the board, in that I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel for every single building. And so then that, again, go back to the point about doing this at the scale that's required, that to me feels like a sensible approach to help speed up the rate of retrofit and speed up the rate at which we're hitting these EPC Cs and Bs, rather than leaving properties behind at D, E, F, and below.
I think if I could just add as well, though, I think one from a commercial point of view, one point that is missed, I think, is just the whole language around this as well, where ultimately from an investment perspective, it's about risk and return, ultimately really simplifying it. A lot of the energy efficiency work and the retrofit work is about resilience of the asset and ultimately reducing risk. more resilient assets, safer, can literally weather the storm. And insurers prefer it, lenders prefer it, and investors prefer it. Again, going back to key drivers in the industry. And I think if we actually just slightly change the language sometimes and maybe don't fly the sustainability flag as high and say, look, this is actually an argument about risk and mitigating risk of investments, I think people will start to understand that the value is there, and that's not just on an energy piece, from a social perspective as well. If you can benefit the asset or the community around the asset that you're in, ultimately they are better places that people want to live and work, higher demand. So it has a financial impact, and it's a lot harder to prove. But I think, again, if you could just change that language and get people to understand that there is a bigger, more profitable way of looking at this, I think you can start to talk the sort of the finance language, which then does get some of these big players involved, because you've got some areas in London that we operate in, and there are some big investors in the area, and actually it would take very little investment as a fraction of their total investment there to make a significant change to some of the neighborhoods. But I think it's just all about that language as well, how we talk about sustainability.
Would they have appetite though, John? It's even if we talk the right language, is their appetite? Is that something they're actively looking for? Is that something we'd have to convince?
I think so, because we did a session at Felberg on biodiversity the other day, and the first half was people questioning it's another metric you have to deliver. If you're going for a planning application, it's just something else you have to do. But then actually talking to some experts and understanding at the micro level how you can deliver a far better asset. It can actually be part of the brand to bring biodiversity in. You attract a different range of occupiers. But then when we're getting these significant heat waves, you're actually seeing quite a marked temperature difference between the area that you're creating this sort of oasis compared to a harsh urban environment. And I think actually just changing that language, people started to understand that there is value in it. And I think the moment you start to do that, financial value, I mean, the moment you start to do that, I think you start to get the attention of a lot of people who would have otherwise dismissed it as just, oh, it's just ESG. And I'm not saying that's the right thing, but I think it's a way of actually breaking through some of the barriers we're hitting at the moment.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Just as on a much smaller scale to the items that you're dealing with, John, we've had a similar experience where we were developing a resilience toolkit for small businesses in a smaller community, and a lot of the feedback we got from workshops and local business groups, we'd created quite a sustainable and science-based toolkit, and they wanted it to be stripped back and, okay, what is important for a small business? How do I stop flooding? Don't worry about climate projections. Don't worry about CO2 emissions and what that looks like. If I've got a basement keg area and I'm a local brewery, how much is it going to cost and what are the dividends for installing that and when do I need to do it? And so, yeah, it's like that language, that was such a common theme for all of the local businesses we spoke to. And that has gone down really strongly, I would say, once we sort of changed the tone there. So it's definitely something we're seeing. I think we're in a really interesting moment now with climate adaptation at the forefront. Adaptation is so much more tangible than mitigation. If we're talking about reducing emissions, that's one thing. If we're talking about preventing heat waves and stopping elderly people dying in care homes and what that adaptation looks like, that's very tangible and I think can relate to everyone. Sorry, that was my 2 cents. We had a couple of comments come in on this question from the audience. I'm just going to read a few out. I don't think we've got time to necessarily go back, but I think there's some really interesting ones here. One around stripping out restrictions on heritage policy and conservation areas and what that means for climate adaptation. I'm going to immediately row back on that and say, Kasang, have you got any thoughts on that based on the social housing work?
Yeah, so when it comes to heritage, it is a tricky one. The reality of the situation is, and I think John's alluded to this, it becomes clear that anything that's heritage or in a conservation area is going to be harder. It's going to cost more money and it's going to be harder to do. It's not impossible, but it's creating that business case for it. And then when we are actually doing that due diligence and weighing the pros and cons, sometimes that asset, it's actually deemed unviable for our clients, doing that initial appraisal, because of the additional uplift to the works and the consultants and the time required to bring them up to the standard that they would want to. So what we're actually seeing in the social housing sector is those properties that are deemed unviable, which are typically the listed buildings in the most beautiful buildings, in the best areas, but need the most improvement and are exponentially more expensive to retrofit, are being placed on a disposal list. And that's what the reality of the situation is if that business case cannot wash its face and be viable, then we will generate another revenue from that asset, and that's typically disposals.
Yeah, no, that's really, really helpful insight. Another comment that it might be good to get Tony's thoughts on. Pretty straightforward. Up the cost of gas and lower the cost of electricity. I wonder how easy you think that might be to be, but also what the impact might have on EPCs and the types of recommendations we give.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at it from an EPC perspective, it definitely would change the outcome of residential EPCs and would incentivize switching from fossil fuels to electric space heating and hot water systems. I guess the reality is that if that happened overnight or even happened within a few years, there's going to be a lot of people who wouldn't have time to change, and then you'd be penalising people who don't have funds or are unable to switch out their gas boilers. I mean, obviously, I'm all for that transition away from fossil fuels, and it's important that we do it. But that sustainability is trying to cover all aspects of sustainability, and what we don't want to do is put more people into energy poverty. And the social housing government funding is driving at reducing that energy poverty and reducing the bills of residents. So it is a delicate balance there. But I think in the long term, what we want to see is not necessarily gas prices going up, but electricity prices coming down with that energy generation mix going more over to renewables and more energy independence. That yeah, we're going beyond the EPCs conversation, but that's certainly the direction that I'm hopeful that things will go. But it's certainly going to take some time. I did just want to say, Connor, on the points around policy again. Completely agree with Kasang's points, and I know working with John on some of the projects for the commercial properties in certain areas, it's been I think it's been a bit of a headache for John and his team to be able to do something that they've done on one property and then on another property they were having to jump through a lot of different hoops, and that's with doing, I would say, high quality retrofit installations of new windows and doors in a sensitive manner. And again, it feels like they're having to each time go through that process starting fresh, rather than saying this has been approved for these neighboring buildings. Here's how it looks. It's sensitive to the conservation area constraints, and hopefully shortcutting that process. But the heritage, if one area of change that I'd like to see is a relaxation of some of the heritage policies, not to completely disband them. As Kasang said, we've got some wonderful buildings in the country, but we do have an old building stock. So it means a relatively large percentage of the buildings that we do need to retrofit have these constraints. And that is then a serious barrier. If we're again looking at how do we do this at the scale required, I think there's got to be some relaxation of those rules. Otherwise, it's not going to be viable from a time or cost perspective. And again, I think that's kind of ringing true for what Kasang said throughout, and also with John on the commercial properties as well.
I think I think it's Camden Council, I may be wrong, but their heritage team introduced a traffic light system where I think they had a set list of alterations that would be green light, which is notify the heritage team. Amber was sort of wait for comment, but it doesn't have to be a full application, and red was you need a full listed building consent. And I think that's a great idea, because things like the example we had on Lonsdale Road, where halfway through all the works we were doing on the road, it became a conservation area. So we were submitting exactly the same designs we had already delivered on the street, but we then had to have a heritage officer come down the road who was fair enough just doing his job, but he was being incredibly pedantic about little details where we were saying, look at the other 10 units, it's exactly the same design. Incredibly frustrating. If you could have a sort of almost self-certify for anything that's a green light, and ultimately it will cut down on their workload as well. So it feels like it's a bit of a win-win.
Yeah, definitely agree. That was a really good conversation. Thank you all. That is the end of the 3 planned questions we've had. We've got about 10 minutes for a Q&A, so I'm just going to pull up some questions that have come in from the audience. The first one we've got here is, do you think it's more important for us to move over from fossil fuel systems like gas boilers to all electric, or is it better to focus on demand reduction and worry about the systems later? Is there anybody that would like to jump in?
I can jump in. I think I've already kind of alluded to what my position will be on this in a previous answer. I personally think, and what we try to do is we lead with comfort first and resident first. So that would allude to, from my perspective, I would say fix the fabric first, because anything you will do to the heat source will not really be working at efficiency if the fabric's not working at efficiency. That's number one. So you could change it. It'll be an easy win, probably an easier one to do. But are you really having the maximum benefit to the comfort of whoever's using that space? Probably not if it's still drafty. It's just more of it's going out of the same leaks if that's not been resolved. That would be my take, I think, is, who's actually using these spaces? These spaces are going to be inhabitable, whether it be residential or whether it be offices and commercial. People are still in those spaces, and I do think we should be thinking about how the people in those spaces are actually what could benefit them.
Yeah, totally agree. Just moving on to the next question. John, this one is from a keen-eared listener that's asked about your sort of role. What are you seeing are the main differences between the UK and German markets when it comes to sustainable development, EPCs, and similar?
Yeah, admittedly, I'm only 6-9 months into the German role, so I'm definitely still learning. But I think the first point is that for the UK, we have one set of ESG metrics for offices, one for industrial logistics. So sort of roughly wherever you are in England, we'll apply the same metrics. I think quite quickly I've learned the different regions within Germany have very different targets. And seeing how complicated that can get, and then also looking at existing targets and then what's down the line and what's changing. So for instance, one of the targets for our industrial fund in Germany is looking at solar PVs and what the regulations are. And it's something like 50% of Germany has PV targets. The other 50% has nothing. But then within a few years, some of the areas that do have targets, they're going to increase targets. Some areas that don't are going to start getting targets. So they're all moving at different paces, which I found quite challenging. I think we've got a life science campus in Berlin with a district heating network. I think obviously something we don't have that much of in the UK. And I think to see the impact on EUI, energy use intensity, for that asset is quite interesting. And then actually seeing how some of the heritage assets operate and how you can retrofit. So to the point about policy and listed buildings, I think if we think it's bad in the UK, I sort of wasn't quite prepared for the delays that the Germans experience with trying to get listed building consents for heritage assets. And I think the retrofitting for things like biodiversity initiatives, PVs, changing the fabric for old buildings is an absolute nightmare. So I think it's definitely different, but I guess our approach ultimately is we have our set strategy, and then we mold the KPIs to suit the location or the sector. That approach is still happening, but on the ground advice is proving absolutely fundamental at the moment.
Yeah, and then maybe just to follow up on that, do you find it similar to the UK where there are sort of swathes of consultancies that are doing EPC and similar? Is it quite like a well-established system in Germany, or is it all still relatively new?
Uh, I'm told we're quite far ahead
Oh,
in
okay.
in a number of different ways in sustainability. So things like whole life carbon assessments,
Yeah.
and upfront embodied carbon, we're doing quite well. Um, I actually had a meeting this morning about some German assets and sustainability, and they were saying the general German approach is there has to be sort of hard data about the financial benefit
Yeah.
to justify, especially things like biodiversity. What is the financial benefit to this asset? Why, like, where is the evidence that it is going to make a better asset? And I guess for some of the areas of ESG at the moment, you have to take a little bit of a leap of faith sometimes and try out a pilot project, see if it works, and sort of trust your gut a bit. And I think that's where I don't want to try and stereotype too much, but from what I've been told, it maybe the Brits, maybe we're just a bit further advanced in some of these areas of sustainability. Um,
Okay.
we're able to take a few more chances and see if things are going to work or not. But that being said, some of the teams we work with in Germany are incredibly forward thinking. So I'm hoping that that's starting to move forward as well.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I think you can forget that, and I think we all have our own frustrations with EPCs and sustainability in the UK, but ultimately a lot of good stuff has been done. So that's good to hear. Just going to wrap up with the final question from the Q&A. This one's for you, Tony. Do you feel that the Warm Homes Grant considers thermal comfort enough in decision making on retrofit measures? Maybe more generally across retrofit, if it's not just the Warm Homes Grant.
Yeah, I think it's a good and important question. Yeah. Short answer would be no, not adequately. But part of going in and doing these surveys is speaking to the residents and asking, are there any hot areas of the dwelling, cold spaces, and it is, yeah, there's quite a high proportion that mention overheating issues, but because it's about reducing energy bills, and typically the building stock in the UK doesn't have air conditioning, you might be uncomfortable, but it's not costing you any energy. Whereas if you're uncomfortable on the cold end of the spectrum, you're using more energy because you've got a means to provide the warmth through using more gas or electricity for your heating system. So I think not currently, and I would expect, we're seeing the trends with the climate changing and how it's just going to get hotter. There will need to be done something changed, I think, in the retrofit assessment to consider that thermal comfort and overheating in more detail. And I forget the phrase that Kasang used earlier, but alluding to the fact of, and I think, a no regret. So we don't want to retrofit these properties and then 5 years down the line realize that certain things have been put in place that have actually exacerbated an overheating issue. So I think it is something that does need to come more to the forefront of the overall whole house retrofit programs.
Kasang, did you have any thoughts on that?
Just to agree with Tony, I think the funding, it's interesting because this wave of funding is the third tranche of this central government funding for the specific decarbonisation of social homes. And with each tranche, the rules have slightly changed, or I would say the priorities of the government has changed. And what I've noticed with this third wave is a push for low carbon heating as a way and a step away from fabric first, which was in the prior waves. So, for me, that kind of shows you and alludes to the answer of, what Tony mentioned, which is no. Because if it's about the comfort, then you would really be, looking at, as I alluded to earlier, making sure that those spaces are actually fit for purpose before you look into changing the energy source. So I think the government is, and if you look at their larger policies, you can probably see why, because I think John mentioned this potentially on this call or when we spoke earlier. An easy win for them would be to decarbonize the grid. So an easy win for central government on their larger policies, regardless of the small ones we tap into, but a larger general manifesto on the energy targets they want to hit is to change and decarbonize the grid. And so now you're seeing that trickle down into our programs, which, okay, let's make sure the low carbon heating connects to the decentralized grid, which will tick that box for us. But what about the people that are serving those homes? So you can see a bit of a contradiction in agendas there. So going back to Tony's first answer, no.
And with that very strong no, that brings us to the end of our session. Yeah, that wraps us up. I wanted to take a moment just to thank all of our panelists, and of course to everybody who's dedicated their lunchtime to a really important conversation. We have recorded the session, so do reach out if you want to share it or watch it again. If you have any questions about Retrofit, please let us know, Love Design Studio, and we can pass it on to both Kasang and John as well. Really excited for the next one, and keep your eyes peeled for our Manifesto for Change in the coming months. Thank you very much. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.